This video is brought to you by Surfshark. Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. Today, we're looking at a video on the channel Questioning Christianity, where the presenter, Dan, asks the question, did the resurrection stories develop like legends? To which the answer is almost certainly a combination of yes, and depends what you mean by legend. So, video over? All done here? I can go home now? Oh, who am I kidding? I'm already home. I never leave my home. I'm trapped inside these walls forever, doomed to a life of work, doing laundry, cooking for kids, doing laundry, packing kids' lunches, doing laundry, more work, a monthly shower maybe, doing laundry, and some sleep if I'm lucky. Did I mention laundry? The only thing that will help me escape this prison of my own making is if you go to patreon.com/ViceRhino and sign up there. That, or this message from today's sponsor, Surfshark. Are you tired of scrolling through your streaming services, not being able to find something new and interesting to watch? Do you live in one of the states that has overly intrusive controls over streaming sites featuring specific types of content? Well, then have I got a solution for you! Surfshark VPN is a virtual private network which allows you to appear to be connected to the internet from any location where Surfshark has a server. By connecting through Surfshark, you can access streaming services as though you were in a different geographic location. This means that you can have access to additional libraries of movies, TV shows, and videos that aren't available in your home area. But that's not all they do. With their Clean Web 2.0 features, you can automatically block ads, reject unwanted cookies without fumbling through that pop-up first, get alerts when a website was the target of a data breach, and block malware. Surfshark also adds an extra layer of encryption to your data, keeping you safe when connected to public networks, even if they've been compromised. Personally, I will never connect to public Wi-Fi without it. Surfshark VPN is easy to use and simple to install. They don't monitor, track, or store your data, and it works on phones, tablets, and laptops with no extra fees. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can try it out completely risk-free. Secure your privacy with Surfshark. Enter coupon code Rhino for an extra 3 months for free at surfshark.deals/RHINO. Again, that's surfshark.deals/Rhino, and enter promo code Rhino for an extra 3 months for free. And remember, by signing up for Surfshark VPN, you're helping to support my channel. Thank you.
Skeptics often dismiss Jesus' resurrection by saying the stories in the Gospels develop like legends over time.
Okay, as long as I'm stuck in this prison of my own making, a fact which was confirmed by Gabriel, I may as well keep watching this video. That was a deep cut for the 90s emo kids in the audience. And yes, the stories in the Gospels did develop like legends over time. We can see the development if we read the books of the New Testament in the order they were written, rather than in the order they appear in the Bible. Paul's writings that talk about Jesus never really treat him as a physical person, but rather as a spiritual being whose presence is experienced by certain people. There's no mention of a tomb in Paul's writings, with the only passage that could be interpreted that way saying that Jesus was buried, but without specifying what kind of burial it was. And in the few instances where he does talk about Jesus in a way that could hint at biographical details, we get things like Romans 1:3-4, which says that Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh, and was declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection, which hint at his view of Jesus as a Messiah in the Davidic sense, a literal descendant of King David who was heir to the throne of Israel, and in line with some first-century messianic ideas, was a prophet heralding of the coming of God's kingdom in a spiritual sense. Then we get Mark, the adoptionist gospel, where Jesus is a mere human being who is adopted by God as his son at his baptism. Now, to be clear, in the culture of the time, to be an adopted son was actually probably a bigger deal than to be a natural-born son. So to say that Jesus was God's adopted son rather than his begotten son clearly elevates Jesus' status quite significantly in this context. The adopted child was the one that is chosen by the father to inherit the father's status and property, not the one that just happened to have shot out of his testicles. That is a huge deal, and I have been guilty of underselling this in the past, leaving it to our modern view, which honestly is kind of gross. The idea that the adopted child isn't really the child of the parents who adopted them. Their real kids are clearly more important. Though the ancient Roman idea of the kid I chose is more important than my actual kid is also kind of gross. But the point is that saying Mark's gospel is adoptionist is not saying that Jesus was only an ordinary dude. He performed miracles, he forgave people their sins, exorcised demons, and more. Things that were impossible for mere humans. but it remains a true statement that Mark's Jesus was not God's equal. The scholarship is divided about the exact nature of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, but the majority of scholars do agree that Mark's Jesus was not God in the sense that modern Christians believe him to be. They will argue over whether the Jewish concept of a royal Messiah, Son of God figure is what Mark had in mind, or if he was writing Jesus as more of a Hellenistic divine man figure, but with more limitations than such a figure would normally have. But there is a general consensus that Mark's Jesus was not himself a god. In Matthew and Luke, the next two Gospels to be written, which were written at roughly the same time, Jesus is now not the adopted Son of God, whom God chose at the baptism, but was conceived by God himself and was recognized as being the Messiah right from the get-go, even by wise men from distant lands in Matthew, and a proclamation of angels to shepherds in Luke. In Matthew's narrative, the author includes numerous parallels between Jesus and the story of Moses. In Matthew, Herod was searching for a child in order to destroy him, so Joseph took Jesus and went away to Egypt. In Exodus, Pharaoh sought to kill Moses, so he fled to Midian. In Matthew, Herod orders the massacre of boys under 2 years of age. In Exodus, Pharaoh orders that all sons that are born to the Hebrews be cast into the Nile. In Matthew, Herod's death allows for Jesus to return from exile to ultimately free the people from their slavery to sin. In Exodus, Pharaoh's death is the catalyst that eventually results in Moses' return from exile to ultimately free the Hebrews from slavery. And if we include midrashic writings, which are writings where ancient rabbis would write commentaries on scriptural passages that, in the case of narrative stories, would fill in the gaps in the narrative and provide theological interpretation, then there are even more details that line up, and they do so in a way that shows that ancient rabbis saw Moses as having a similar status as Matthew attributed to Jesus. Onto the Gospel of Luke and the companion book Acts, written by the same author, we see a similar Christology as in Paul's writings, but with more emphasis on Jesus as an eschatological prophet rather than a Messiah in the Davidic sense. And so far, in all of these views of Jesus, we have essentially a man who is a prophet. There are varied layers, and we can see the nature of the man shifting more towards divinity as time goes on, but they all seem to have shared the view that a prophet should expect to suffer martyrdom, and that in Jesus' case, the martyrdom itself was a part of the fulfillment of his messianic duties. Moving on to the Gospel of John, however, Jesus is much more explicitly identified as being God in a sense that is close but not identical to the modern Christian Trinitarian views. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The exact meaning of this passage is still debated among scholars, but one thing is clear. The Word is Jesus, and it is identified with God when it says that the Word is God, but it has a separate identity from God. However, it is debatable just how much this carries the implication of divinity with it. And while John places Jesus on equal footing with God on a number of occasions, even having Jesus identify himself with the I am phrase that was reserved for God alone, an argument can still be made that John did not view Jesus as being God himself. Rather, he is God's emissary. As such, he has the full authority of the one who sent him, he is to be treated by those who receive him as though he were himself the one that he is representing, and he will return to the sender after obediently carrying out his mission. Being God's emissary gives him the power of God, allows him to identify himself with God using the I am phrase, and his perfect obedience was possible because of his heavenly nature, being the Word who was there from the beginning. His heavenly origins also make him the only one to have ever seen God, and as such, only he can be the ultimate and definitive prophet of God, because he has seen God and can speak in unity with him. So we see the nature and divinity of Jesus growing as time goes on, which makes the idea that the story of Jesus was experiencing a legendary growth as it was retold and embellished by those doing the telling, not only quite plausible, but rather obvious. I didn't even get into the non-canonical documents that were written around the same time as Paul's letters and the Gospels, which show the same general trend.
Alex O'Connor, for instance, argues that it is suspicious that Mark, as supposedly the first Gospel written, includes no resurrection appearances of Jesus.
Sure, it is a bit suspicious, but I'd actually argue that we don't really know. We do know that the ending of Mark in our modern Bibles was a later addition, with the story apparently ending at the point where the women run away from the empty tomb and say nothing to anyone about they saw. That, by itself, would be a rather awkward ending to the story, but it would also fit the theme that Mark had of Jesus telling people not to say anything of the miracles that he had performed. He would heal someone, command them not to tell anyone, and then they would blab about it all over the place. So for his final and greatest miracle, the resurrection that is to save humanity, the witnesses are finally told to go and proclaim it to everybody. And this is when they actually shut up about it and say nothing to anyone. That's the kind of literary callback that we'd expect of Mark, but the truth of the matter is that we don't actually know if this was the intended ending of the original author. The scholarly consensus is that it probably is, but there is still debate about it. Either way, it doesn't look good for biblical authenticity. Either the original ending is completely lost to history and any speculation about what it might contain is simply that, speculation, or it ended right where it did and we're left with no post-resurrection appearances, though certainly the resurrection is still proclaimed by the man in the tomb. And then we have a bunch of definitely not authentic verses tacked onto the end to give the story a more natural ending.
But that these stories do start to appear later in Matthew and Luke, coming to a fantastical crescendo with John's Gospel as the last to be written.
I don't think the resurrection really is the key to the developing legend idea. Right from the beginning of Christianity, Christians believed in a resurrected Jesus. Sure, there's some evidence that what exactly that meant developed over time, with the earliest ideas seeming to have been a spiritual resurrection, with appearances happening through visions, with a physical resurrection coming later, but the idea of legendary development is more about the Christology, which is a word that has many different potential meanings, but to oversimplify it, it's essentially a measurement of Jesus' divinity. Was he a mostly normal guy who was exalted to divine status as part of the resurrection, as Paul suggests in Romans 1? Was he exalted at his baptism, as in Mark? Was it part of his conception, as in Luke and Matthew? Or has he always been exalted, as in John? That's what the legendary growth is referring to. As his legend grew and he posthumously became a more important figure, it became less believable to early Christians that his exaltation to the status that they believed that he had would have happened later in life, so it kept being pushed earlier and earlier until eventually John's Jesus was just always exalted. But that's not where it ended, because even then, John didn't present Jesus as being the same being as God in the sense that modern Christians think of him. That was a continuation of that legendary development, and now we have modern Christians reading divinity into earlier texts where it is not apparent.
The alleged culmination? Well, a story of Jesus supposedly telling a doubting Thomas to believe without evidence.
No, a story of Jesus providing tangible evidence to a doubting Thomas, followed by him saying that those who do believe without evidence will be blessed. Get it right, it's your own book.
Can we simply chalk up the resurrection stories to legends that developed as the Gospels progressively rolled out over time?
Well, like I already pointed out, the resurrection was a belief held by the earliest of Christians, and I know of nobody who claims otherwise. So by making this about the resurrection specifically, rather than the other elements of the stories that point towards early beliefs about the nature of Jesus, you're attacking a straw man position rather than the actual position.
Or does this skeptical trope need to be buried under the weight of textual evidence?
The way you're presenting it, yes, it needs to be buried, preferably more thoroughly than Jesus was.
Well, let me give you 3 reasons why the development hypothesis, it needs to die. First, Paul's early list of Jesus' resurrection appearances, it undermines the development hypothesis.
Oh yay, it's Paul's list. Fantastic. Wonder if we'll finally get a name for any of those 500 witnesses. Although, first century Judea, I'm willing to bet one of them was named Judas, probably another one was named James. It's like those seem to be pretty common names for the time.
Scholars recognize that in 1 Corinthians 15, penned in the early 50s AD, Paul is quoting a creedal tradition that dates back to within a few years of Jesus' death and resurrection.
Yes, which kind of kills its legitimacy as a challenge to early audiences to go and check with these people who are still alive. This passage is often used to say that Paul wouldn't have listed people who witnessed appearances of Jesus if they hadn't actually witnessed it, because people could just go and check with them to see if it was true. Which has a number of problems that I'm not going to get into at the moment, but if that statement was actually a creed that was recited by believers, and Paul merely wrote it down while adding his own twist to the ending, then we have no reason to believe that Paul even knew who any of the 500 were, much less that he'd know how to contact them or would be able to share that information with anyone else. It's just a line in a creed that gets recited. It being a creed removes its credibility as an actual historical event.
At the end of this creed, Paul offers an extended chronological list of 6 appearances of Jesus to different individuals and groups. First to Peter, then to the 12, then over 500 believers, then to James, implying Jesus' half-brother, then to all the apostles, and then finally to Paul, with the abnormally born reference hinting at his own Damascus Road conversion some years after Jesus' ascension.
Yeah, so remember that. It's important. Paul includes himself in a list of people to whom Jesus had appeared, and his encounter with Jesus is never described in a way that makes it clear that he's having an encounter with a bodily resurrected Jesus, but rather is having visions of a spiritual Jesus. In Acts, Paul is said to have seen a light and heard a voice, and depending on whether we're in Acts 9 or Acts 22, the people who are with him either heard the voice but didn't see anything, or saw the light but didn't hear anything. Either way, that's clearly not a physical dude that they ran into on the road. And since Paul included himself at the end of the list of people to whom Jesus appeared in 1 Corinthians, or I guess we're calling it 1 Corinthians now, then that heavily implies that the other visions could very well have been similar spiritual experiences rather than an actual physical manifestation. This is another aspect of the legendary growth idea. If the resurrection idea started with a very small number of grief hallucinations, which are a fairly normal occurrence among people who experience the loss of a loved one, then there wouldn't be a physical Jesus to tour around providing experiences to people. The story of the resurrection would spread by word of mouth and grow as it did so, as such things are wont to do. Now, this is just speculation on my part, but why are Cephas and James the only named disciples or apostles in the list? He appeared to Cephas, who is one of the 12, then he appeared to the 12. He appeared to James, who is one of the apostles, and then he appeared to all the apostles. It seems to me, and again keep in mind this is speculation on my part, that if Cephas and James were the only two to have had a grief hallucination themselves, being the origin of the resurrection story, then their names would be the ones that get repeated most frequently as the story is retold. But it wouldn't make sense that Jesus would appear only to those two, but not the rest of his most loyal followers, so somewhere along the line in the telephone game, they got added on as well. Like I said, this is speculation, but it is entirely plausible. And as a plausible, non-magical explanation, it is infinitely more likely than an actual resurrection. And whether you like it or not, the story of Jesus did grow in between Paul's writings and the Gospel writings, and continued to grow afterward. John did not describe the same Jesus as Paul, Mark, Luke, or Matthew, and even in the Synoptic Gospels there are very important differences, which means that, historically speaking, we are just about as certain as it is possible to be that a good chunk of the Gospel stories did not happen as written.
Now, Paul's list here, it undermines the development hypothesis in three ways. First, 1 Corinthians is either penned before or relatively contemporary to Mark's Gospel.
It was definitely before. Paul was writing in the 50s, Mark was written around 70 at the earliest, and given that Paul was a very well-traveled man who wrote letters everywhere he went, if there were any written biographies of Jesus in existence while he was alive, he would have known about it. But his writings show no knowledge of any of the Gospels. Sure, by itself this is far from definitive, it is effectively an argument from silence after all, but it is highly suspect.
And yet it lists 6 separate resurrection appearances of Jesus, which is even more than John's Gospel decades later, which only boasts 4.
Oh, I see. So your straw man of the legendary growth idea relies entirely on just counting up the total number of appearances and assuming that more appearances means more growth? Nothing about the nature of the appearances, the nature of Jesus himself in those appearances, the nature of Jesus during his life, the beliefs and practices described in the various writings, the insertion of apologetic explanations for objections that were raised after an earlier text was disseminated, etc. Just a straight up, he made more appearances in the earlier account, therefore that's more legendary than the later accounts? At least put some effort into your straw, people. This is just embarrassing. And what's more, if I take your methodology here at face value, that means that the story shrunk over time. Is that what you want to argue?
Second, Paul's list includes at least 2 appearances that the later Gospels never elaborate, to the 500 and to James.
As the legend grew, certain details got dropped. That happens too. I see no issue. And really, you'd expect that if the appearance to the 500 were actually a real thing that happened, then one or more of the Gospels would have bothered to give it at least a passing mention.
Along with a third to Peter, which Luke's Gospel only mentions in passing.
Wait, what? Luke doesn't even allude to it. Peter was just the first man to verify that the women at the tomb were correct in saying that Jesus was missing. John, however, has Peter sitting down and having a one-on-one conversation with Jesus during his appearances. Sure, it's not an appearance to Peter by himself, but I'd still say that that counts as an appearance to Peter if there was enough of a conversation between the two of them to have modern Bible translators put it in its own little section.
Surely if the Gospel authors wanted to pen legendary stories for propaganda purposes, then these 3 are incredibly fertile ground to bolster the case for Christianity.
Not necessarily. Comparing Paul's list of appearances to the list in John, the first thing that we notice is that in John, it's not a list, it's a narrative. Paul lists Cephas or Peter, then the 12, then the 500, then James, then the apostles, then himself. While this is a list, his use of the word then does appear to mean he was writing in chronological order, so if I wanted to, I could nitpick the fact that this list has him appearing to people in a different order than any of the other accounts, but putting that aside, giving 2 specific people and 3 vague groups of people with no specifics is way less developed than he appeared to Mary as she was crying after realizing his body was missing. Then he appeared in the middle of a locked room to the disciples, showed off his handholds, breathed the Holy Spirit onto them, but they weren't all there, so he came back and did it again while Thomas was there too, this time actually letting Thomas finger his holes. Then there was another appearance to 7 of the disciples where he makes them magically catch lots of fish, and then follows that up by reversing Peter's 3 rejections of Jesus by having Peter say that he loves him 3 times. And then the book ends with a never-ending story-esque. There are many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, the world itself could not contain the books that would be written about it. Now, if you count up the specific instances of his appearances there, yeah, that's only 4 appearances in John compared to 6 in Paul's writings. But I'd say that if a story begins its life as nothing more than a dry list with no details, and then 50 years later that same story is a shorter list, but contains several paragraphs of specific details about each item on the list, finishing with a more vague, and there were a bunch more appearances after this, I'd say that does indeed show the evidence of legendary growth. But you're also assuming the motivation of the gospel authors, saying that the argument is that they were writing dishonestly for propaganda purposes, rather than just recording the stories as they knew them in their various times and communities. If the stories went through decades of organic growth before they got to the gospel authors, then they could very well have been convinced that what they were writing was true, and so were not writing for propagandistic purposes, though certainly there were some times when certain details were emphasized that clearly had the motive of answering challenges posed to the fledgling new religion, like the guard at the tomb in Matthew. The author of Matthew could have actually believed that that was a true story, but he made sure to emphasize it, even including a bit about how that's a lie that's still being spread to this day.
With Peter being the apostle's spokesperson, 500 being a huge sample of eyewitnesses, and James being a former skeptic who, as Jesus' immediate family, would have had insider access to important features of Jesus' life.
Indeed. Curious then that the eyewitness events that would have provided the strongest possible eyewitness evidence if we had more details about them were the ones that were dropped as the story got fleshed out. A cynical person might see that as evidence that the people who might have been inclined to actually ask those people about their experiences found that they weren't quite as represented in the creed. Of course, there's no actual positive evidence for this, but that would certainly account for why such important events got left out of the more detailed telling of the story later. Also, with regards to Jesus' brother converting, if we grant that it really happened, I find that to be more evidence against the resurrection. Why is that? Because Jesus had 4 brothers and at least 2 sisters. So at a minimum, that is 1 out of 6 of his siblings that were convinced that he came back from the dead. Of the 6 people who grew up with him and knew him before any of the God powers showed up, Jesus managed to convince 1 that he was actually the Messiah. And he didn't manage that until after he died and then came back. There are 2 options here that I see that are more plausible than an actual resurrection. First is that James had a bereavement hallucination, and through this hallucination, he became convinced that what Jesus said in his earthly ministry was actually true, and honestly converted, with that hallucination being his post-resurrection appearance. The other option is that James saw a new religion growing around the rumor of his dead brother's resurrection, and opportunistically took advantage of the automatic clout he would get as the brother of Jesus. Both of those options are more likely than an actual resurrection, and would explain why Jesus had such a dismal failure rate of convincing his siblings that he really was who he claimed to be, with at least 83% of them rejecting him.
So the restraint of the gospel writers not to conjure up legends from Paul's list, that works against the development hypothesis.
Nope. The fact that it was merely a list, and then later on it was a fleshed-out narrative with specific details, supports the idea of legendary growth.
And third, Paul's list only spotlights male apostles in the appearances, whereas the Gospels increasingly place women as crucial eyewitnesses. Given the embarrassing nature of the women's testimony for any apologetic purposes in the ancient world, if these stories were developing legends, why would the Gospel authors not simply follow Paul's example of spotlighting the male disciple?
Well, the easiest and most obvious answer to this is so that they could do exactly what you're doing here. Use the fact that they spotlighted women's position in the story as an apologetic. Why would we do that if it weren't true? I've told enough lies in my life to know that purposely inserting embarrassing details makes it more believable. But that aside, this is actually excellent evidence of legendary growth. So let us now construct a hypothetical. At first, the followers of Jesus weren't really concerned with his body. All of the appearances were spiritual things. Jesus was thrown in a mass grave somewhere, and nobody even knew where his body would be in the first place. Then, as the details of the story were fleshed out over time, the tomb aspect was added, as it seemed odd that the Messiah would be discarded in such a disrespectful manner. But now we have to explain what happened to his body, so he became a physically resurrected Messiah. But then this creates a weird situation. They didn't have time to prepare the body for burial after he was taken off the cross because of the Sabbath, though this would be something that it was normal for women to do. So they have women going to prepare the body, meaning that they would have to be the first people to notice that the tomb is empty. And being the first people noticing the empty tomb, they are also the first people who get appearances, both from angels that proclaim that Jesus is risen and from Jesus himself. I feel like that is a fairly plausible hypothetical. But now, let's look at the nature of these encounters. In Mark, if we ignore the part of the story that we know for a fact was a later addition, it ends with an unnamed man telling the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee, and there they'll meet Jesus. If we go with the ending that is most frequently found there, he appears to Mary Magdalene first, who then tells the disciples, and the disciples did not believe her. In Matthew, Jesus shows up and tells the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee, where they'll see him, which the disciples apparently did, even though some of them doubted even after seeing him. Which, actually, now that I think on it, that detail seems like it could be another apologetic that Matthew baked into the story. If we assume that there was an historical truth at the center of the embellished gospel stories, this seems to me to point to the fact that after Jesus died, some of his closest followers just went back to their ordinary lives and did not become Christians when some of the others began saying that Jesus rose from the dead. So that line could be an attempt to explain that fact. Back to the women, in Luke, an angel rebukes them for seeking the living among the dead. They go back and tell the disciples, who don't believe them, with Peter going to the tomb to double-check for himself, and the actual first appearance of Jesus being the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. In John, Mary Magdalene finds the empty tomb, runs back to tell Peter and one other disciple, who then run back to the tomb to verify that it's empty. After they leave, Jesus appears to her and tells her to tell the disciples that he's back, which she does. So, ignoring the contradictions, in every instance where Jesus appears to the women, he doesn't have a message for them, he has a message for them to give to the men. Go tell the men that this is what I want them to do. In one, he doesn't even appear to the women, leaving this message for the angel to deliver. And in two of the stories, the author makes a point of explicitly saying that the men did not believe the women, with John still having the men run and verify what the women have said, even though he doesn't comment on whether or not they believe the women. Now, I could just leave it here. The women were doing work that it was normal for women to do, and since women weren't thought of as highly as men, each gospel came up with a way to minimize the women's role by having them as mere messengers to the men, with extra emphasis in some that the men didn't even believe the message until they verified it for themselves. But there's another aspect to the story here, and that is simply just paying attention to the type of stories the Gospels were. Jesus was hanging out with tax collectors, prostitutes, and other sinners whose sins are less specific, healing people whose diseases are caused by their sins, rebuking the righteous for not caring for the unfortunate souls that Jesus was there to minister to. His entire ministry centered around him bringing hope and forgiveness to those who society looks down on. If the women receiving the message to give to the disciples elevates their status, then that is right in line with his ministry in the rest of the Gospels. Honestly, given the elevated status that the disciples had just from their proximity to Jesus, it makes sense that he would pass them up for the first appearance and instead go to the women with their perceived lowly status. So from a narrative perspective, there is no reason to think that women getting first dibs on the resurrected Jesus would have even been an embarrassing fact for early Christians, who were largely made up of the same sorts of people that Jesus ministered to: the slaves, the disadvantaged, the outcasts. In light of the rest of his message, it would have been more embarrassing if Jesus stopped focusing on them and began focusing on those of higher status after the resurrection. And this actually highlights one of the main problems with using the criterion of embarrassment to determine the reliability of an historical document. It assumes that we actually know what the author would have been embarrassed by. They're writing a story of a guy who regularly hung out with the dregs of society in defiance of social expectation, and that's part of his appeal. Why would they be embarrassed that he continued to do that after the resurrection? Not that women were the dregs of society, but they did have a lower status than men. It is entirely possible that the gospel authors, rather than being embarrassed by this, saw it as a source of pride. Our God is a God who cares about the lowly, the weak, the outcasts, not one who sticks to societal norms at their expense.
Instead, with Matthew's story of the women bumping into Jesus on the streets of Jerusalem, or John's garden tomb encounter with Mary Magdalene, skeptics would have to argue that these stories develop like legends in a manner that is counterproductive to the Gospel's credibility.
Quite the contrary, they developed like legends in a way that would be most appealing to the kinds of people who made up the majority of Christians for the first century or so of Christianity's existence.
In other words, it would make for terrible propaganda.
Again, the argument is not that they were purposefully developed with propagandistic intent. It is that the gospel authors wrote the stories that they were familiar with, which had developed organically as they were orally told and retold.
Second, skeptics tend to be slippery when it comes to what constitutes development.
That's at least partly due to some of the slipperiness of the terms used to describe development. Well, at least for ones who want to be thorough about it rather than just making shit up. Which, let's be clear here, I have tried to be thorough about my position, supporting it with peer-reviewed works written by biblical scholars, and trying to keep the references recent, but a lot of what I have said has been speculation on my part, just so stories, so to speak. I've tried to make the distinction between scholarship and my speculation very clear, both by displaying my sources on screen when I'm saying things that I got from them, and by explicitly stating when I'm creating hypotheticals, but I am basing my hypotheticals on what is plausible given our understanding of the culture and text that we have access to. The point of a hypothetical in this sort of discussion is not to say this is exactly how it happened for sure, it is to say this is a plausible way it could have happened without requiring an actual resurrection to make it plausible. And if there is even a single way it could plausibly happen without an actual resurrection, then given the nature of the study of history, that pretty much rules out the resurrection as an explanation, because natural events will always be more probable than supernatural ones. And apologists are perfectly willing to accept this when it comes to any other historical document that isn't related to Christianity. Hell, they even do that with some that are. The majority of claims in the apocryphal Christian writings get completely dismissed, with only the stories of the disciples being martyred being even partially accepted for purely apologetic reasons.
The analytic philosopher Lydia McGrew has catalogued 5 ways that development could be measured in the resurrection account. Development in the sheer number of narrated appearances of Jesus, development in the level of detail that these stories recount, development in the apologetic intent or shape of these stories, development towards a higher Christology or Trinitarian theology, or development in the weirdness factor of these stories.
Well, the Christology is what I've mostly been focusing on, with occasional tangents into the amount of detail. But even then, Christology is not a term that has a settled meaning among scholars. In every paper I referenced that dealt with it, one of the first things the author would do was explain what they meant by Christology, and it wasn't always the same thing. In some, Christology is a measurement of divinity, with a low Christology meaning that Jesus was a mere human, and a high one meaning that he is more supernatural, which could again mean different things. It could mean that he's a divine man in the Hellenistic sense, a heavenly being of some sort, or it could go all the way up to identifying him with the God of Israel. Others define Christology by the behavior of early Christians. A high Christology would be one where Jesus is the subject of liturgical expressions and worship. And in still others, it is functionally a measurement of how well Jesus fit in with the Jewish expectations of the Messiah at the time. There is some overlap among these definitions, and I tried to use sources that agreed enough on the important bits that their differences wouldn't impact my overall point, but the fact is that Christology is not a term that always means the same thing from one scholar to the next, and it likely gets even more wobbly when the laypeople like you and me start getting involved. Also in this context, Lydia McGrew is also a layperson. She styles herself an interdisciplinary analytic philosopher, but her only academic qualification is a PhD in English. She is married to Tim McGrew, with whom she works on a number of apologetic arguments that are mostly ignored by mainstream apologists, but again, Tim McGrew is a philosopher, not an historian or an expert in any relevant biblical studies. And to be clear, I am not saying that people with no qualifications shouldn't comment on stuff like this. My whole job is just me being a guy with 0 qualifications commenting on stuff that smarter people than me have been studying for their entire lives, after all. But citing a layperson with an interest in the subject is not the same as citing an actual expert in the field.
Notice, though, that if you bracket Mark out for a minute, the other Gospels, Matthew, Luke, and John, either tie or continually trade places as to who comes out on top as the most developed, depending on which category.
Well, I think I've laid out a decent case for Matthew and Luke being roughly tied, with John coming out on top. Wait, do I have the wrong tab open? Alright, no, that's the phrasing. Okay, Matthew and Luke are all tied up, possibly wearing gimp suits, while John tops them. And I didn't need to leave Mark out of it to get there. Leaving Mark in, and Paul too, with the criteria that I used, it shows a clear development as time went on.
When it comes to the sheer number of appearances of Jesus, both Luke and John recount 4 resurrection stories.
Well, John did end with his, and then Jesus went on and did so much more shit that if you wrote it all down, the books wouldn't even fit on the entire earth. So if we include that line, then John actually wins by number of appearances, as the number is so high that it can't even be numbered. But as it turns out, that's irrelevant, as simply the tally of post-resurrection appearances is not something that I've ever seen anyone argue counts as evidence for legendary development.
Allowing, of course, for Luke's implicit mention of an appearance to Peter in Luke 24:34.
Oh, what do you know? That's a my bad. I decided not to go back and correct my earlier statement that Luke doesn't even allude to it, because this gives me an opportunity to point out how confusing it can be that the Bible doesn't consistently refer to the 12 disciples with the same names. Like, this isn't even getting into the fact that when you combine all of the disciples from the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts, you wind up with at least 14 of the 12 disciples being named, with the potential for a 15th if Levi is not the same person as Matthew, as is usually thought. But just looking at Simon Peter, in the book of Luke, it's very inconsistent. So when I saw at the beginning of the chapter that it called him Peter in verse 12, and since this is well after Jesus changed his name to Peter, whether we're going with John's timeline or Matthew's timeline, I didn't think to look for Simon. But there it is in verse 34, staring me right in the face. Okay, I'll allow that that could be a reference to an appearance of Jesus to Peter in the same way that it is referenced in 1 Corinthians. But again, the total number of appearances is, at best, a single item to consider when looking at legendary development, not the whole thing in and of itself, and it's a very minor item at that.
When it comes to detail, Matthew's Roman guard report, Luke's Emmaus Road encounter, and John's fishing escapade, they all carry similar fleshy minutiae, so no winners there.
Fleshy Minutia was the name of my grunge band in high school, but I feel like Luke would be the clear winner there. Not sure why you didn't go with that. By word count, it's the longest, and if you include the book of Acts, it wins hands down. But again, this is, at best, a very minor single item that should be considered when looking at legendary development, not the whole thing in and of itself.
Apologetic intent yields similar result, since both Luke and John record Jesus' invitation to touch his scars and so prove he is no ghost.
Apologetic intent is a tricky one, because it's another one that would require us to know the mindset of the author in situations where that's just not possible. Like, yeah, Luke and John both do have Jesus present his wounds to the disciples for examination, though John's Jesus only explicitly allows Thomas to finger his holes, while Luke has them all up in there at the same time, like the very naughty Messiah he is.
He's not the Messiah, he's a very naughty boy!
But what about Matthew's guard at the tomb? Did you count that? It very obviously has apologetic intent to counter the stolen body idea that the author of Matthew explicitly references, or John's tendency to directly contradict the synoptic gospels in what appears to be an attempt to give a high Christological response to the low Christological claims of the synoptics, where his high Christology Jesus couldn't show weakness like the low Christology Jesus of the synoptics. So when Jesus begged God to take the cup away from him, John responded by saying, "Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Or how all the synoptics have Jesus being not able to carry his cross, so Simon of Cyrene is forced to carry it for him. Well, John doesn't just not mention such a thing happening, but goes out of his way to say that he carried his cross himself. Those could have apologetic intent behind them, but they could also just be linguistic coincidences. Maybe taking a cup was just a really common metaphor for dealing with difficult situations, so seeing them all use that wording wasn't unexpected. And yeah, John doesn't explicitly state that Jesus carried his own cross the entire time, and the synoptics don't explicitly state that Simon carried it the entire time, so maybe the idea of Jesus starting to carry the cross, stumbling, and then Simon being forced to carry it was correct, despite the more natural reading of each account being the one that leads us to a contradiction. But hey, contradictions aren't why I'm here today. It's just that these contradictions could very easily be evidence of apologetic intent, but it's difficult to be sure without being able to interview the author. And even then, it would be difficult to quantify in a meaningful way in light of the discussion of legendary development. Even the earliest gospel, Mark, was written long enough after events that we'd expect to see plenty of answers to common objections baked into the narrative. There is nothing about legendary development that demands that an increase in apologetic shenanigans must continue at the same rate indefinitely. It wouldn't surprise me if this metric had a plateau, where, even as the legend continues to grow, the growth of apologetics in the narrative levels out. But since this is ultimately a meaningless metric, it doesn't actually matter.
And Matthew's conversation between the guards and the chief priests, that responds to an early anti-Christian polemic from the Jewish leaders.
Ah, okay, you did count that. So, since you recognize that the guard at the tomb is a response to anti-Christian polemics, and since Matthew is the only canonical source for the guard at the tomb, What makes you think that that aspect of the story is in any way historical, rather than just being an apologetic device that was added to the story specifically to counter the stolen body argument?
So again, no line of development.
I mean, there's a line of development that shows one of the Gospels apparently including baked-in apologetically motivated passages that counter the previously written Gospels, but go ahead and believe that this is somehow not indicative of legendary development if you really have to, which I guess you do in order to continue believing what you believe.
When it comes to theology, surely Matthew's baptismal formula in the Great Commission, the Trinitarian shape of it, shows the highest Trinitarian theology.
Sure, that verse is used by modern Christians to support the idea of the Trinity, which is an idea that is never explicitly mentioned in the Bible, but does that translate to a higher level of legendary development? And does that mean that you recognize that there is no reference to the Trinity in the book of John, or the other two synoptics for that matter? Does there being theological differences in different communities of Christians somehow not point to the development of the story as time goes on? That's rather expected, is it not? As the story is retold in different locations to different people who focus on different aspects of the story as being important, the theological beliefs of these people in these different locations will become more and more different from each other. So the fact that such an important doctrine as the Trinity is only ever hinted at in the Gospels, and only once out of the four of them, is very highly indicative of a story that has been changing over time.
And the disciples, they worship Jesus in all three Gospels. So again, no development.
Interestingly, Matthew and John are the only Gospels that depict the disciples worshiping Jesus before the resurrection. And honestly, I thought I was going to have to deal with a difficult point here, as I expected to find a bunch of passages talking about Paul worshiping Jesus, or telling others to do so. But he doesn't actually seem to do it all that much. There are a couple places that could be interpreted that way, like how in 1 Corinthians 5:4 he describes people assembling together in the name of Jesus, and Philippians 3:3 where it says, "We are the circumcision," gross, "who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh," which is rather ambiguous and made worse by the fact that most translations actually render that something more like, "We who serve God by His Spirit, who boast in Christ Jesus, and who put no confidence in the flesh." And that's pretty much it. I mean, I'm sure that there are some references that I missed. All I did after all was just search for the word worship in all of Paul's writings, and then do a basic Googling to see whether Paul encouraged people to worship, and those were the only two that came up. It's not like Paul didn't talk about worship. He talked about worshiping quite a bit, but it was nearly always either in the context of worshiping God, not Jesus, or people worshiping false gods or idols. So to take a step back and look at the broader picture, Jesus does not appear to have been explicitly a figure that was worshipped in the Pauline letters. Mark gives no mention of Jesus being worshipped before or after the resurrection, leaving us with Luke and Matthew as the earliest books that explicitly describe Jesus as having been worshipped. They were both written around the same time and in different communities, so we would expect the developments to be a bit different, and indeed it is. Luke doesn't depict anyone worshipping Jesus until after the resurrection, but Matthew has one instance of Jesus being worshipped pre-resurrection, right after he performed a big miracle, as well as one post-resurrection worship. John, conversely, doesn't explicitly state that anyone worshipped Jesus after the resurrection, and only has one instance occurring before. I'm not entirely sure how to interpret this information, but there does seem to be a trend of more worship for Jesus, specifically as time goes on, rather than that worship being directed at God. Now, it's hard to tell for sure with so few data points, but this does remind me of another aspect of the story that changed over time. In the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is reluctant at times to perform miracles, doing so only out of necessity when people are hungry, in danger, sick, and whatnot. In several cases, he tells the recipients of the miracles to keep their mouths shut and not tell anyone of the miracles. He even rebukes the Pharisees at one point when they ask him for a sign, saying that it's an evil and adulterous generation that seeks a sign. No sign will be given except the sign of Jonah. In John, however, the latest of the Gospels, Jesus explicitly performs his miracles as signs so that people might believe. He even rebukes people for seeking him out for reasons other than his signs, in another sharp contrast with the Synoptic Gospels. John 6:25-26 says, "When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, 'Rabbi, when did you come here?' Jesus answered them, 'Truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves.'" So in the earlier Gospels, Jesus wants to keep his magical powers mostly a secret, and asking for signs is an evil thing. But in the later Gospel, Jesus regularly makes big shows of his miracles, and gets annoyed when people follow him for free food instead of the magic show.
And as for the weirdness factor, it's hard to go past Matthew's earthquake and angel story, saying nothing of the infamous mass resurrection of the Old Testament saint from their grave.
So Yeah, that is weird. But if we're looking at weirdness, I say we keep looking past the canonical documents and into the Apocrypha, where Jesus at one point shows up as a giant who's followed around by a talking anthropomorphic cross. But I don't see why time passing inherently would make legendary stories more weird. I think Paul saying, "we are the circumcision" is fucking weird, and that was a fairly early writing. Hell, I think the weirdest thing in the Bible is also one of the oldest. That story where God decides out of nowhere that he wants to kill Moses, and then Moses' wife saves him by performing a hasty circumcision on their son, and then rubs the foreskin on Moses' feet, calling him a bridegroom of blood. That results in God deciding against killing him for some reason. And that's the whole story. There is no context to it. It just happens out of nowhere. Not entirely relevant here, but it's always a fun one to bring up. Anyway, back to the Jerusalem zombies of Matthew. I think this might actually be another instance of Matthew inserting apologetics into the narrative. You see, in first century Judea, tombs were not individual. They were family affairs. If Joseph of Arimathea allowed Jesus to be buried in his tomb, it would not have been his own personal tomb that was meant just for him when he died. It would have been his family's tomb, which would have already contained at least a few generations of dead people. But if the story had already gotten to the point of a tomb, and the women finding an empty tomb was already a well-established belief, then one would expect there to be an explanation for why Joseph of Arimathea's deceased family members were not in that tomb as well. If all the dead people left their graves and started wandering the streets of Jerusalem around the same time as Jesus was resurrected, then that takes care of it nicely. Of course, it still leaves us with a bunch more questions, like what happened to all those dead people afterward? Did they just go back to their tombs? Did they ascend bodily into heaven? Did they just keep living as though nothing had happened? Inquiring minds want to know.
That's why skeptics are often haphazard in their approach. They tend to cherry-pick stories to compare from just two Gospels, often including Mark.
Wait, you're saying that as though including Mark is a bad thing. Why would including all of the stories when comparing all of the stories be a bad thing? Hell, I've even gone past that and included Paul's writings. I'm even willing to get into the Apocrypha if that's where you want to go, but why should we exclude Mark?
And they slip between the 5 categories when it suits to compare apples to oranges.
Well, the problem is that the 5 categories, aside from Christology, aren't really meaningful categories. When I say that there was legendary growth, I'm talking about the apparent divinity of the human being known as Jesus. And that is a thing that I find very obvious, from Mark's very human Jesus all the way up to the nearly God-man of John's Jesus. This is the Christology, with Christology being defined in the ways that historians and biblical scholars typically define it, not the way doctors of English who play at philosophy in their spare time define it.
So the simple reality is, without Mark's Gospel, the development hypothesis is DOA.
Okay, but we have Mark's Gospel. So...
Which leads to third, Mark's silence, it proves nothing. Jesus' 3 resurrection appearances in Mark's Gospel all come in what is known as the long ending of Mark, or verses 9 to 20. Since this portion of the text is not found in the earliest manuscript, the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus, and because it switches in reported style to simply confirm other stories in Matthew, Luke, and John, critical scholars generally regard this long ending to be a later addition.
By generally regard here, he means unanimously agree with the exception of a very small handful of hardcore evangelicals.
That's why modern Bibles, they bracket out that text and explain why in the footnote. But if we leave off this long ending, that means Mark's Gospel now ends abruptly and unresolved at verse 8, with frightened women running from the angel and empty tomb, and with no resurrection appearances of Jesus.
Yep. And of course, if we boil the legendary development idea down to the straw man that you seem to think it is, 0 is a smaller number than 4. So given that there are 4 in John and 0 in Mark, it was legendary development, QED. Which is, of course, a ridiculous argument that nobody is making, but you can go ahead and refute it now.
But even if this abrupt cutoff is the original ending of Mark's Gospel, and that is a big if, Mark's silence proves nothing for the skeptic wanting to establish development.
I mean, it kinda would. The argument is that as time went on, the story became more developed. If there were no resurrection appearances in the first gospel to ever be written, well, at least the first one we actually have copies for, then that's a huge point in favor of development over time. The problem is that, while scholars mostly agree that verse 8 was the author's intended endpoint, that's not conclusive. There is still room for doubt. So while we know that verses 9 through 20 are not original and were in fact later developments, we are fairly sure that it ended at verse 8. But there remains the very small but still very real possibility that Mark did have resurrection appearances that did not survive. So whatever conclusions we might be able to draw from the idea that Mark originally ended at verse 8 should be tempered with the knowledge that it was possible that that's not where it ended.
Why? Well, how about the controversy surrounding its ending in the first place? Various theories are proposed by critical scholars as to whether the original ending was lost or what it may have been. So surely that should mean that Mark at least serves as a questionable baseline, especially when we already have Paul's early list of 6 resurrection appearances.
I really don't understand how he can go from talking about this as though the number of appearances are the main crux of the argument, to then talking about how legendary growth is a concept that isn't nailed down quite as well as Jesus was, with there being several potential ways of measuring it, and then back to talking about it as though the total number of appearances are the main thing again, right after complaining about people who are skeptical of the resurrection being slippery with their usage of words.
Then there is the question of whether Mark is even the first gospel penned, or whether, like the early church fathers testified, Matthew came first.
Well, given that Matthew and Luke both very obviously copied from Mark, it would be difficult indeed for Mark to have been written first. It's really hard to copy off something that doesn't exist yet.
Which again would torpedo the development hypothesis.
Again, though, not really. By the time the Gospels were being written, it was more about the fact that the communities responsible for producing them were geographically isolated, so the development could continue in different directions. The amount of development isn't the biggest detail there, and especially with documents as interdependent as the Synoptics are, swapping the order that a couple of them were written in wouldn't really do a whole lot as far as development goes. Except it would make it really weird that Matthew was expanding on Mark's ideas before Mark had those ideas.
But even if Mark was first, and it did end abruptly, you bump into the fact that skeptics are still making the worst kind of argument from silence.
I doubt it, but go on and explain so I can give an example of a worse one.
Namely, using Mark's silence or the absence of evidence to try and rule out the credible testimony or positive evidence we do have in the other gospel.
Oh wow, that didn't even go where I thought it was going. I thought it was just going to be something more like, just because nobody wrote about Jesus using the I am language to identify himself with God before, doesn't mean he didn't do it. I'm sure people knew about him doing it right from the get-go, they just decided not to write it down for more than half a century. Which would be a terrible example of an argument from silence, because that would be such a huge deal that it would be expected to have been covered at some point by a very early Christian author, and that coverage would be such a huge deal that you'd expect the church to do their best to preserve it, and would then be shouting about it from the mountaintops. But no, you're just going with, Mark didn't mention things that could be attributed to legendary growth, the Gospels that were written later did, so that's obviously not legendary growth, it was Mark choosing not to even hint at some of the most important aspects of the religion for some reason. Like, no, man, that's not an argument from silence, it's an observation that the story grew over time. And the fact that Matthew and Luke copied most of Mark word for word, and then expanded on it, is indisputable among serious biblical scholars. Sure, maybe the expanding that Matthew and Luke did was based on oral retellings of the story that were at least as old as Mark, but that does not negate the idea that the story grew as time went on. And if we just look at the documents that we have, we definitely see a pattern of growth over time.
Matthew, Luke, and John as biographies of Jesus clearly incorporate sources who were close to the facts.
Citation needed? You can't just say shit like that and expect me to take it at face value. But hey, at least we can infer from this that you don't think Matthew and John were eyewitness accounts, so good job?
And the authors have a good track record of honest reportage from other internal and external evidences.
Again, citation needed. Regarding the author of Luke and Acts, I'll quote an article that I've already referenced a couple times, The Christology of Early Christian Practice. Quote, when dealing with Luke's descriptions of practice in the early Jesus movement of the first chapters of Acts, we find ourselves both earlier and later in time than with Paul. Earlier because the narrative concerns the earliest post-Easter followers of Jesus in Jerusalem, later because the narrative is shaped toward the end of the first century. While it would be naive to take Acts as a historical report of early Christ believers in Jerusalem, it would be equally simplistic to read Luke's narratives as representing general Christian practice and belief in his own time and environment. To paraphrase, Luke was writing much later than Paul, about a time in the religion that predated Paul, and he was trying to faithfully represent the beliefs and practices of the people of the time, but we know from other sources, including Paul, that Luke wasn't always correct. When looking at the scholarship, the consensus seems to be that Jesus was a real guy who was baptized by John the Baptist and crucified by the Romans, but basically every other detail about his life and ministry is debated. According to James Belby, professor of systematic and philosophical theology, and Paul Eddy, professor of biblical and theological studies, both at Bethel University, a Baptist-affiliated Christian university, quote, "Virtually everyone in the field today acknowledges that Jesus was considered by his contemporaries to be an exorcist and worker of miracles. However, when it comes to historical assessment of the miracle tradition itself, the consensus quickly shatters." So basically, the consensus among scholars about how accurate and reliable the Gospels are is non-existent. Different scholars will tell you different aspects of the book are more reliable than others, each willing to provide their own extensive analysis and reasoning. Given this lack of consensus, stating definitively that the Gospels have a good track record of honest reportage is a stretch, to say the least. I'd be willing to bet that this idea comes from the apologist's tendency to treat a document's reliability as a monolithic statement. That is, if you find one thing in the book that is true or accurate, then the whole book must be true and accurate. So then when we find non-biblical writings that confirm that Pontius Pilate existed and was governor of Judea, then all four of the Gospels must be accurate, because they also say that Pilate existed and was governor of Judea. Never mind that the Gospels disagree dramatically with the non-biblical sources about the kind of person Pilate was. Pilate existed, so the Gospels are correct and accurate, QED. That's not how scholars treat it, but that does tend to be how apologists look at it.
So given Mark's abrupt ending doesn't rule out the notion that Jesus appeared alive again to his disciples, and in chapter 14 even implies that he would go ahead of them into Galilee after his resurrection, it makes no sense to try and use Mark's silence to discredit the reliability of other Gospels when it comes to the resurrection stories they recount.
Right. I keep forgetting that you're just arguing against a straw man version of the idea of legendary development, causing me to accidentally take you seriously. So, once again, for those in the back, the idea that the story developed and grew over time is not solely based on the total number of times Jesus said to have appeared to people after he died!
Now, if you're worried about the differences between the Gospels, or how the details fit together when you read the Gospels horizontally or side by side, be sure to check out our other video, Do Contradictions Disprove the Resurrection?
Okay, I'll put that in my list of things to respond to, but I'll also leave a link to a video where I discuss the reliability of the Gospels with relation to other historical sources, a comparison between the Gospels, their geographical accuracies and inaccuracies, and more.
The development hypothesis really does need to die. And happily so, because we have a better way of making sense of why the four Gospels share the same core events but include different appearances of Jesus to his disciples after his resurrection. And it's the OG explanation, that the Gospel authors simply use different eyewitness sources when they pen their biographies of Jesus.
I guess that confirms that he doesn't believe any of the Gospels to have been written directly by eyewitness, so credit where it's due. But there's also no reason to think that any of the Gospel authors had direct access to eyewitnesses, and plenty of reasons to think that they were compiling stories from multiple sources, both written and based in oral tradition.
But Jesus is alive, and as much as the disciples struggled to believe it, their skepticism gave way to worship as the evidence overwhelmed their doubt.
Well, that's great for them, but until Jesus gives me at least as much evidence as the disciples had by letting me finger his holes, I shall remain skeptical. Actually, I'd like to think that I'd remain skeptical even in that scenario. Which, to be clear, does not mean that I would reject the claim that Jesus is the resurrected God no matter what evidence I was provided, which seems to be what apologists think skeptical means, but in reality, it means applying critical thinking to claims that are made and evaluating their evidence while trying to minimize the impact that bias has on my evaluation. Apologists are fond of using the word skeptic to be roughly synonymous with atheists, as this one is doing here, but not all skeptics are atheists, and not all atheists are skeptics. And that's not even getting into the whole debacle that happened when atheist YouTubers started referring to themselves as skeptics, all while failing to utilize even basic skepticism when evaluating non-religious claims, thinking that them deciding that religion was false proved that they are skeptics, so obviously they applied the same rigor to other areas. See my response to Armoured Skeptic for what I think is one of the worst offending examples. And that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Shaunik Byrne, who says, "I'll give you this. Quite often I hear atheists argue for morality based on their interpretation of good and evil, and it's so hard for me to explain to them that in their worldview, good and evil can only be a construct. I wish this would get out more. If I had a dime for every time I heard an atheist say something was evil, I would be rich." So, without getting into the argument about where morality even comes from, I find this comment to be an excellent example of the sheer audacity that Christians regularly put on display. If you interact with atheists on a regular basis and find yourself confused at the fact that they don't seem to be convinced that they believe what you tell them they believe, then maybe it's your understanding of their beliefs that is flawed. Like, in this case, I could even agree that good and evil are constructs, but that does nothing to diminish their perceived importance in our lives. There are plenty of things that are constructs that are, for better or worse, incredibly important to our day-to-day lives. Money, corporations, language, gender, the calendar, nations, religion, and a bunch more. The way you are saying that implies that you think a construct is something that isn't real and therefore isn't important. But there are almost no details of our lives that are not directly impacted by at least one, but more realistically dozens of such constructs. So evil can both be a construct and a real thing that impacts people's lives. And given that we don't generally assign moral labels to things that, if they happen on Earth where people live, we would consider them bad, but since they're happening somewhere where no people live, nobody's impacted by them, with my go-to example usually being the hurricane on Jupiter, then it seems as though evil is indeed a construct. People refer to a hurricane that hurts people as evil. We do not refer to a hurricane that isn't hurting anyone on a faraway planet as evil, because evil is a construct. Hurricanes are not. So maybe if you take the time to understand the actual atheist perspectives on morality and moral labels like good and evil, you'll be less frustrated when they don't take your attempt to explain their own worldview to them seriously. And yes, I pluralized perspective there because atheism is not a monolith. I know for a fact that there are atheists in my audience who disagree with me about morality, so they would likely disagree with my assessment here. And the way you would figure stuff like that out is not by insisting that you are correct about their beliefs despite what they say, it's to listen to them with the goal of actually understanding their position. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to surfshark.deals/Rhino to get 3 extra months for free. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I livestream with Surus every Wednesday at 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, Unknown Designation, and all the rest, who are the number of appearances that prove the story of my channel did not grow over time. If you'd like to not even be relevant to the question of legendary growth, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time! And there they'll meet Jesus. Mate Jesus. They'll mate Jesus. Sexy Jesus wants to mate with you. Few generations of dead people. But where'd that come from? Christology being defined in ways that historians and biblical scholars typically define it,